Standing on the porch of what should have been my childhood home, I felt the weight of 43 years pressing down on my shoulders. The farmhouse looked exactly as I remembered it from my last visit 15 years ago, before the great falling out that had torn our family apart. The white paint was peeling now, and the wooden steps creaked under my boots, but the smell of hay and distant cattle still carried on the morning breeze. My name is David, and this is the story of how I fought for what was rightfully mine against a half-brother who thought blood meant nothing and greed meant everything. The farm stretched out before me, 300 acres of prime agricultural land in Nebraska that my father had worked his entire life to build. Rolling fields of corn and soybeans extended to the horizon, interrupted only by the red barn that housed our prize-winning Holstein cattle. I had driven 12 hours straight from Denver after receiving the call from my father's lawyer. Dad had passed away in his sleep at 78, and apparently there were some surprises in his will that nobody had expected. My half-brother Marcus had been running the farm for the past decade, ever since Dad's health started declining. Marcus was 10 years younger than me, the product of Dad's second marriage after my mother died when I was 16. The relationship between Marcus and me had always been complicated. When Dad remarried, I was already in college, trying to build a life away from the painful memories that haunted every corner of this place. Marcus grew up here, learned to drive tractors before he could legally drive cars, and naturally assumed he would inherit everything. After all, he was the one who stayed, who worked alongside Dad through good harvests and bad weather, who never left for the bright lights of the city. But blood has a way of complicating even the simplest assumptions. The lawyer's office in town felt cramped and stuffy, filled with the smell of old leather and legal documents. Mr. Henderson had been Dad's attorney for over 30 years, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses who spoke in measured, careful tones. Marcus sat across from me, his jaw set in that familiar, stubborn expression I remembered from our childhood arguments. "Gentlemen," Mr. Henderson began, adjusting his glasses as he opened the thick manila folder, "your father's will contains some specific provisions that I believe will surprise both of you." He cleared his throat and began reading the formal language that would change both our lives forever. The first part was expected. The house and 50 acres would go to Marcus, along with all the farming equipment and livestock. Marcus leaned back in his chair with a satisfied smile, probably thinking this confirmed what he had always believed. But then Mr. Henderson continued reading, and that smile began to fade. "To my son David, I leave the remaining 250 acres of farmland, including all mineral rights, water rights, and future development potential." The lawyer's voice seemed to echo in the suddenly silent room. "This land represents the original family homestead that has been in our family for 4 generations. Marcus shot up from his chair like he had been stung by a wasp. "That's impossible. Dad would never split up the farm. We talked about this 100 times. He said the land should stay together, that breaking it up would destroy everything he built." Mr. Henderson held up his hand calmly. "There's more, Marcus. Please sit down." He waited until my half-brother reluctantly returned to his seat before continuing. "Your father included a letter explaining his decision. He wrote that David's portion represents the land that belonged to David's grandfather, which was merged with the additional acreage your father purchased over the years." I sat there stunned, trying to process what this meant. 250 acres of prime Nebraska farmland was worth well over $1 million, possibly more depending on development potential. Marcus exploded the moment we left the lawyer's office. Standing in the parking lot under the harsh afternoon sun, his face was red with anger and disbelief. "This is bullshit, David, and you know it. You left this place 25 years ago and never looked back. You've got your fancy engineering job in Denver, your city life. You don't need this land." I tried to keep my voice calm, though my heart was racing. "Marcus, I didn't know about this any more than you did. Dad never mentioned splitting the farm to me. Don't give me that innocent act," he spat, pacing back and forth between our pickup trucks. "You must have known something. Why else would you drive all the way out here for the reading? You could have handled this over the phone." The truth was, I had come because I wanted to pay my respects to Dad, despite our complicated relationship. The last conversation we had 3 years ago had ended in an argument about my mother and why I never visited. I had hoped that maybe, somehow, we could have made peace before it was too late. "Look," I said, leaning against my truck. "Maybe we can work something out. I don't know anything about farming anymore. Maybe we can arrange some kind of lease agreement or—" "No!" Marcus cut me off. "You don't get it, do you? That land is the heart of this operation. Without it, what I inherited is just a house and a barn with no room to grow, no way to expand the herd or rotate crops properly. Dad's gift to me is worthless without your peace." He stepped closer, and I could see the desperation behind his anger. "I've got a wife and 2 kids, David. This farm is all I know. It's all I've ever wanted to do. You've got a whole other life. Just sell me the land at a fair price, and we can both walk away happy." But something in his tone, the assumption that I would just roll over and give him what he wanted, reminded me of every childhood argument we had ever had. That night, I stayed at the old Comfort Inn on the edge of town, staring at the ceiling and trying to make sense of everything. The will had stirred up memories I had spent decades trying to forget. I remembered working alongside my grandfather on that very land when I was 8 years old, learning to identify different types of soil, understanding the rhythm of planting and harvest that had sustained our family for generations. My grandfather, Dad's father, had been a quiet man who spoke more through actions than words. He had taught me that land wasn't just dirt and rocks. It was legacy, responsibility, and connection to something larger than yourself. When he died, I was 12, and I had assumed that wisdom would pass directly to my father and eventually to me. But then Mom got sick with cancer, and everything changed. Dad threw himself into work, expanding the farm, buying new equipment, anything to avoid dealing with the reality that his wife was dying. I spent those last 2 years of high school taking care of Mom, while Dad buried himself in the fields. When she finally passed, the house felt like a tomb, and I couldn't wait to escape to college. Marcus was only 6 when Mom died, too young to understand the weight of loss that settled over our house like dust. His mother, Sarah, was a kind woman who tried her best to fill the void, but I was already too angry, too hurt to let anyone get close. I left for college and rarely came back, building a successful career in civil engineering while the farm continued without me. Now, lying in this generic hotel room, I realized that Dad's decision to leave me the original family land wasn't just about property division. It was his way of acknowledging that I had lost something when Mom died, something that Marcus had never had to lose. The land was an apology, a recognition, and maybe a chance for redemption. The next morning brought a phone call that changed everything. Mr. Henderson's voice was tense when he reached me at the hotel. "David, we have a problem. Marcus filed a legal challenge to the will last night. He's claiming undue influence and questioning your father's mental capacity when the will was written." I felt my stomach drop. "What does that mean exactly?" "It means the estate is now tied up in probate court until this gets resolved. Marcus has hired Bill Crawford. He's the most aggressive litigation attorney in the county. They're arguing that your father was suffering from early-stage dementia and that someone influenced him to change his will unfairly." The implications hit me like a physical blow. Not only would I have to fight for the inheritance, but Marcus was essentially calling Dad mentally incompetent and suggesting I had somehow manipulated a sick old man. The accusation felt like a betrayal of everything I knew about my father's character. "How strong is their case?" I asked, already knowing I needed to find my own attorney. "Honestly, it's weak on the facts. Your father had a complete cognitive evaluation just 6 months ago as part of his life insurance renewal, and he passed with flying colors. But Crawford is good at creating doubt, and he knows the local judges. This could drag on for months, maybe years." I spent the rest of the morning calling lawyers in Omaha and Lincoln, trying to find someone who specialized in estate litigation. Most were either too busy or wanted retainers I couldn't afford on short notice. Finally, I connected with Jennifer Walsh, a sharp-tongued attorney who had built her reputation taking on big agricultural corporations in land disputes. "Your half-brother is playing hardball," she told me during our phone consultation. "But from what you've described, your father was very deliberate about this decision. The question is whether you're prepared for a real fight, because that's what this is going to be." Looking out my hotel window at the farmland stretching to the horizon, I made my decision. Jennifer Walsh turned out to be exactly what I needed. A lawyer who understood both the legal complexities of estate disputes and the emotional dynamics of family farm inheritance battles. When she arrived in town 3 days later, she immediately began building our case with the methodical precision of someone who had fought these wars before. "The first thing we need to establish," she explained over coffee at the local diner, "is your father's state of mind when he wrote this will. Marcus is claiming dementia, but the medical records tell a different story." She spread out a folder of documents on the table between us. "Your father updated his will just 8 months ago, and he was very specific about his reasoning. He actually wrote a detailed letter to Mr. Henderson explaining his decision, which wasn't read at the initial meeting. The letter, written in Dad's careful handwriting, was like hearing his voice from beyond the grave. He explained that he had always intended for the original family homestead to return to me, recognizing that his remarriage and my subsequent estrangement had created an unfair situation. He acknowledged that Marcus had worked hard and deserved security, but he also felt that I had been cheated out of my birthright by circumstances beyond my control. "There's more," Jennifer continued. "Your father actually consulted with 2 other attorneys before making this decision, and he had multiple conversations with his financial advisor about the tax implications. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment choice or the confused rambling of a sick man." But Marcus and his lawyer weren't backing down. Bill Crawford had filed additional motions claiming that I had manipulated Dad during my last visit 3 years ago, despite the fact that visit had ended in an argument. They were also challenging the validity of the land surveys, suggesting that the property boundaries were unclear and that the will was therefore unenforceable. "They're throwing everything at the wall to see what sticks," Jennifer said. "It's a common strategy when you don't have strong facts on your side, but it also means this is going to get expensive and ugly before it gets better." That afternoon, we drove out to the farm to document the property boundaries and take photographs. Walking the property lines with Jennifer and a surveyor revealed something I hadn't expected. The land Dad had left me wasn't just valuable for farming. The eastern boundary ran along a ridge that overlooked the Platte River Valley, and recent development in the area suggested that residential or commercial development could be extremely lucrative in the coming years. "This explains why Marcus is fighting so hard," Jennifer observed as we stood on the ridge, looking out over the rolling landscape. "He's not just losing farmland, he's potentially losing millions in future development rights." The surveyor, an elderly man named Pete who had been mapping land in the county for 40 years, pointed out something even more significant. "That creek running through the middle of your property? That's spring-fed, never runs dry even in drought years. Water rights alone could be worth a fortune if the area keeps developing." I began to understand that Dad's gift was more complex than I had initially realized. He hadn't just given me land. He had given me the most valuable portion of the family holdings, the piece with the greatest potential for future growth. Marcus's inheritance, while substantial, was limited to the working farm operation with little room for expansion or diversification. That evening, Marcus called me directly for the first time since the confrontation in the parking lot. His tone was different now. Less angry, more calculating. "David, I've been thinking about our situation. Maybe we got off on the wrong foot. Why don't you come out to the house tomorrow? Sarah's making her famous pot roast, and the kids would love to meet their Uncle David." The invitation felt like a trap, but I was curious about his change in strategy. "What's this really about, Marcus? Look, we're family. Dad wouldn't have wanted us fighting like this. Maybe there's a way we can work together instead of letting the lawyers get rich off our family's problems." Against Jennifer's advice, I agreed to have dinner with them. I wanted to see the farm operation up close, to understand what Marcus had built over the past decade, and maybe to find some middle ground that could end this dispute without destroying what was left of our relationship. The farmhouse felt strange and familiar at the same time. Sarah had redecorated extensively, erasing most traces of my childhood memories, but the bones of the house remained unchanged. The kitchen where Mom used to make Sunday breakfast still had the same view of the barn, and the living room still creaked in the same spots when you walked across the old hardwood floors. Marcus's children, Emma and Jake, were polite but clearly curious about this uncle they had heard about but never met. Emma, who was 12, peppered me with questions about life in the city, while 8-year-old Jake was more interested in showing me his collection of toy tractors. For a moment, sitting around the dinner table, I could almost imagine what it might have been like if our family had stayed together. But the real purpose of the evening became clear after the kids went to bed. Marcus poured 3 glasses of Dad's old whiskey and got down to business. "David, I want to make you an offer. I'll buy your portion of the land for fair market value. Agricultural use only. $1.2 million cash within 60 days. It was a substantial offer. More money than I had ever imagined having at one time. But Jennifer had already explained that the development potential could make the land worth 3 or 4 times that amount within a decade. "That's generous," I said carefully, "but I'm not sure I'm ready to sell." Sarah leaned forward, her expression earnest. "David, I hope you don't think we're trying to cheat you, but this farm is our whole life. Marcus has expanded the herd, improved the soil quality, built relationships with buyers. Without that eastern section, he can't rotate crops properly or expand the grazing areas. We'd essentially have to start over somewhere else." Marcus nodded, adding, "Plus, you don't know anything about farming anymore. What are you going to do with 250 acres of cropland? Hire someone to manage it? That'll eat up most of your profits." They weren't wrong about my lack of farming knowledge, but something about their urgency made me suspicious. Why the rush? If the land is only valuable for agriculture, it's not going anywhere. The look that passed between Marcus and Sarah told me everything I needed to know. The next morning, I drove into town and spent several hours at the county planning office, researching recent development proposals and zoning changes. What I discovered explained Marcus's desperation and his willingness to pay over $1 million for land he claimed was only valuable for farming. A major development company had quietly been buying up land throughout the county, preparing for a massive residential and commercial project that would transform the entire area. The preliminary plans, filed just 2 months before Dad's death, showed a proposed shopping center, residential subdivision, and recreational vehicle park that would require exactly the type of ridgetop land with water access that I had inherited. The development company had already approached several landowners in the area, offering prices that were 3 to 4 times the agricultural value. Marcus must have known about this. His name appeared on a preliminary survey as a potential seller, dated just 6 weeks before Dad passed away. When I called Jennifer with this information, her response was immediate and sharp. "That son of a bitch knew exactly what he was doing. He was probably planning to sell to the developers himself until your father's will threw a wrench in his plans." The pieces were falling into place. Marcus hadn't just been angry about losing part of the farm. He had been counting on a development windfall that would have set his family up for life. Dad's decision to leave me the most valuable portion had derailed those plans completely. "This changes everything," Jennifer continued. "If Marcus was negotiating with developers while your father was still alive, it suggests he was already planning to break up the farm despite all his talk about keeping it together. We can use this to counter his claims that your father was mentally incompetent or that the will was against his stated wishes." That afternoon, I drove back out to the farm, but this time I wasn't going to the house. I wanted to walk the land, to see it through my grandfather's eyes and my father's eyes, to understand what they had really left me. Standing in the middle of the cornfield that my grandfather had first planted 60 years ago, I finally began to understand what Dad had really given me. This wasn't just about money or property value. It was about preserving something that connected our family to the land and to each other across generations. The soil beneath my feet was rich and dark, the result of decades of careful stewardship and crop rotation. My grandfather had taught Dad how to read the land, how to know when to plant and when to harvest, how to work with the natural rhythms instead of fighting against them. Dad had passed that knowledge to Marcus, but he had also recognized that the land itself held memories and meaning that couldn't be transferred through farming techniques alone. I remembered a conversation with my grandfather when I was 10 years old, shortly before he died. We had been walking this same field, and he had told me that the land didn't really belong to us. We belonged to it. "Your job," he had said, "is to take care of it so it can take care of the next generation." At the time, I had thought he was talking about farming, about the practical aspects of soil management and crop production. But standing there now, I realized he had been talking about something deeper, about responsibility, legacy, and the connections that bind families together, even when they're scattered across time and distance. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Have you thought about my offer? The lawyers are costing us both money we don't need to spend." But this was no longer about money. The developers might pay more, and Marcus might pay quickly, but selling would mean breaking a chain that had connected 4 generations of my family to this specific piece of earth. Dad had trusted me with that responsibility, even though I had spent 25 years running away from it. I called Jennifer and told her we were going to fight. The courtroom in the county courthouse was smaller than I had expected, with wooden benches that looked like they had been there since the building was constructed in the 1920s. Judge Patricia Morrison, a woman in her 60s with steel gray hair and sharp eyes, presided over the proceedings with the no-nonsense efficiency of someone who had seen every type of family dispute imaginable. Bill Crawford, Marcus's attorney, presented their case with theatrical flair, painting a picture of a confused old man manipulated by a distant son who had suddenly developed an interest in the family farm. He brought in witnesses who testified about Dad's occasional forgetfulness in his final years, his tendency to repeat stories, and his expressed desire to keep the farm intact. "Ladies and gentlemen," Crawford addressed the judge, "this will represent a complete departure from Harold Mitchell's lifelong commitment to preserving the family farm as a single, viable operation. The evidence will show that he was suffering from cognitive decline and that his judgment was compromised by family pressures he was ill-equipped to handle." But Jennifer was ready for this attack. She methodically presented the medical records showing Dad's cognitive competence, the multiple legal consultations proving his deliberate decision-making process, and most damaging to Marcus's case, the evidence of his secret negotiations with the development company. "Your Honor," Jennifer argued, "the plaintiff's real objection to this will isn't based on concern for his father's mental state or the integrity of the family farm. The evidence shows that Marcus Mitchell was already planning to sell the very land he now claims should remain in agricultural use. His father's will simply prevented him from profiting from a sale that would have destroyed the farm's agricultural viability forever." The turning point came when Mr. Henderson took the stand and read Dad's full letter explaining his decision. In his own words, Dad described his regret over the way my mother's death had driven a wedge between us, his recognition that Marcus had earned security through his hard work, and his desire to ensure that the original family homestead would remain connected to both branches of the family tree. "I know this decision may cause conflict," Dad had written, "but I believe it's the right thing to do. David lost his mother and his connection to this place when he was too young to understand what that meant. Marcus has built a good life here and will continue to prosper, but the land that my father left me should return to David, along with the responsibility to preserve it for future generations." Judge Morrison took 2 weeks to render her decision, but when she did, it was comprehensive and decisive. She upheld Dad's will in its entirety, finding no evidence of mental incompetence or undue influence. More importantly, she specifically noted that Marcus's secret negotiations with developers undermined his claims about wanting to preserve the farm's agricultural integrity. "The evidence clearly shows," Judge Morrison stated, "that Harold Mitchell made a thoughtful, deliberate decision about the disposition of his property. While that decision may have disappointed some family members, disappointment is not grounds for overturning a valid will." Marcus and Sarah were devastated by the ruling, but I felt no satisfaction in their defeat. Standing outside the courthouse after the hearing, I approached my half-brother with a proposal that had been forming in my mind throughout the legal battle. "Marcus," I said, "I want to make you a different kind of offer. I'll lease you the farming rights to my land for the next 20 years at below-market rates. You can continue operating the farm as a single unit, but the land stays in the family, and any development decisions have to be made jointly." He looked at me suspiciously. "What's the catch?" "No catch. But I want to be involved. I want to learn about the operation, maybe spend some time here during planting and harvest seasons. And I want Emma and Jake to understand that this land belongs to all of us, not just one branch of the family." It took several more months of negotiation, but we eventually worked out an agreement that satisfied both our needs. Marcus got the operational control he needed to run a successful farm, and I got the chance to reconnect with the land and the family I had lost so many years ago. 6 months later, I was back on the farm for corn harvest, working alongside Marcus and learning to operate equipment I hadn't touched since I was a teenager. The work was harder than I remembered, but there was something deeply satisfying about the rhythm of the harvest, the smell of fresh-cut corn, and the knowledge that we were continuing something that had sustained our family for 4 generations. Thank you for listening to my story. It's been a journey of discovery, conflict, and ultimately reconciliation that taught me that sometimes the most valuable inheritance isn't money or property, but the chance to understand where you come from and who you're meant to be. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Please let me know what part of the world you're listening from, and if you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to the channel for more real-life tales of family, conflict, and resolution.